большое спасибо всем, что пришли. Здравствуйте, Сьюзен. Сейчас у нас выступит Сьюзен McHugh, профессорка английского языка в Университете Новой Англии, США. Она исследует и преподает литературные, визуальные и научные нарративы о межвидовых отношениях. Она является авторкой нескольких книг, в том числе «Dog» и «Love in Time of Slaughters. Human Animal Stories Against Genocide and Extinction», которая выйдет на русском языке в издательстве Academic Studies Press в 2025 году. McHugh является редакторкой двух книжных серий «Palgrave Studies in Animals and Literature» и «Plants and Animals: Interdisciplinary Approaches», а также главной редакторкой журнала Society and Animals. Тема ее выступления «For the Birds or Flocking to Pro-Animal Nature Films». И сейчас в чат я отправлю 2 ссылки на ключевые примеры Сьюзен.
I want to start by thanking Antonina for that lovely introduction, Mark, Yana, and Lillian for organizing this amazing critical animal studies section, and the simultaneous Russian translation. I'm a stupid person. I only speak English, so thank you. I also thank your support team at Shaninka for hosting us as part of the Vectors conference, and thank you to everyone for making time to be here today. It's a tremendous honor to be included in such an illustrious group of scholars and activists. In honor of the happy coincidence that the Russian translation, as Antonina just said, of my last monograph is now going to press, my talk takes a deeper dive into some questions about contemporary bird fictions and films that I explore there. Only I had been more explicit in that book about how the writing was driven in part by my own need to educate myself about the birds along with the animals, plants, and especially peoples belonging to the place that I've called home for the last 20 or so years. I'm tuning in here from my home in Auburn, Maine, USA, which is on the southern fringe of what was once the continent-wide Great North Woods. Scientists are unsure why, but here in our Maine woodlands, there are surprisingly hopeful signs of resurgence. It is one of the few places in the world where many wild bird populations appear to be growing, even amid their northward territory migrations due to climate change. But the land is also marked by losses here, too. This place has long been known as Amitganpantuk by the peoples of the Wabanaki Confederacy, from whom Euro-white people like me stole it. I'm grateful for their generosity and their persistence on these lands, and I ask you please to join me in supporting their efforts and the work of all Indigenous peoples in their ongoing struggles for justice. Mapping linkages of extinction and genocide is where my research and writing has been going, and in this talk I'll explore how representations of wild birds in literary, in nature film history, that these representations are linking together in ways that might be interpreted as signs that things are changing for the better. Why birds? Like bees, birds have long played special cultural roles in the generation, illustration, and transmission of stories of sexual reproduction. In the English language, a common euphemism for sexual knowledge is the phrase, the birds and the bees. So in polite company, you might inquire within earshot of an adolescent child whether said child knows about the birds and the bees or has learned about the birds and the bees without leaving the innocent any the wiser. Today, however, it seems that the birds and the bees has become a dead metaphor with dying reference, whose passings portend an apocalyptic vision like no other. The first quarter of the 21st century has witnessed the greatest waves of honeybee die-offs ever recorded on this continent, and in 2025, the US is predicted to lose 70% of our honeybee colonies, the worst annual decline ever recorded. A heavily monitored and imported domestic hit, honeybees in decline bode ill as well for less studied wild natives. While the disappearances of bird species more generally fails to make headlines like that, their populations and diversity have fallen ever since bird counts started centuries ago, mirroring this pattern of massive scale disappearance worldwide. Because the forage of many bird species both depends on and includes bees and otherwise likewise imperiled pollinators, the phrase the birds and the bees might soon become a genteelism for extinction, not least because so many others depend on the increasingly fragile existence of so many of them. As animate creatures who assist in the sexual reproduction and genetic outcrossing of most vegetal species, an estimated 75% of crop plants, including most fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, as well as 90% of wild plants worldwide, the disappearances of pollinators can never just be ends in themselves. The intricate relations of the birds and the bees that once so powerfully symbolized fecundity in times of flourishing now seem ripe for redirecting towards raising concerns about surviving ecological threats. Here I want to explore a couple of narrative routes through which different kinds of bird stories take wing in sympathetic tales that reflect and influence growing perceptions of them as endangered communities, not just like, but deeply entangled with our own. Whereas in the book, I write a lot about contemporary fictions featuring honeybees in a pivotal role, today I'm focusing just on bird stories. As the category of wild animals that is most frequently encountered by people today, birds claim a special role in everyday perceptions of shared multi-species worlds that range far beyond the dynamics of pollination. Of all categories of non-human animals, their literary history is arguably the farthest ranging in terms of symbolic and other human-centered meanings, at least in Anglophone traditions. As literary critic Jeff Carnegie more precisely observes, the notion of birds as either a means of appreciating nature or understanding the human place in the world is a common thread that runs through the history of much American writing on birds. In the discussion to follow my talk, please tell me more about birds in the Russian and Slavic traditions, because, again, I'm ignorant and I wonder whether this association of birds with the work of eco-criticism is not culturally, but rather historically specific. So that's one big question for all of you. For birds loom large in the advent of film technology and its recent deployment to address the mutual imperilment of human and animal populations. Tracing flight lines above and beyond the built-over world that is intensively occupied by all things human, the spectacle of migrating flocks increasingly appeals to a sense of the precariousness of migrations, whether in terms of dwindling bird flocks or growing waves of displaced humans. One recent example that links human and avian migrants is A Short History of Indians in Canada, the title story of Cherokee-Canadian author Thomas King's collection published in 2005. The story is even more brilliantly told through director Nancy Byman's 2017 short animated film adaptation, also titled A Short History of Indians in Canada. And again, the link is in the chat in case you're interested. As a satirical premise, the story's original author, King, who also wrote the screenplay and stars as one of the voice actors in the film, in the story, King crafts a devastating metaphor through the spectacle of indigenous beings crashing into the modern urban architecture, cropping up along their old migratory routes. The story begins with a first-time visitor to Toronto asking a hotel doorman where to find some excitement in the city, and being directed toward a neighborhood where he instantly spots a flock of Indians flying into a skyscraper. Members of a cleanup crew attending to the bodies explain that he is lucky to witness them in migration, and that they themselves have been tasked with bagging the dead and tagging the living. Toronto's in the middle of the flyway, the tourist is told. The lights attract them. However, in the place of the real-life birds sometimes provided with this kind of care, the fictional victims in King's satire are a different kind of feathered being. More specifically, they're members of tribal groups in regalia decorated with plumage. Crew members explain that they identify the bodies by their feathers, using a birdwatcher-type field guide that is organized instead by the sartorial choices traditional to indigenous nations. Long aligned in the Euro-Western taxonomizing imagination, feathered beings and feathered wearers here collapse into one super exoticized migratory form haplessly cast in deadly encounters with the literal structures of modern colonialism. The story's humor hinges on seeing the feathered humans, along with other animals, as subjected to the colonization of their lands as well as their knowledges. In North America, erections of glass tower buildings and electric infrastructures at the turn of the 20th century almost instantly became associated in migration seasons with massive pileups of dead birds, counted and lamented, but not therefore prevented. Unlike birds, the losses of indigenous humans who flocked to these rising urban landscapes passed largely unremarked. A footnote to the genocide colloquially known as the Indian Wars, the famous skywalking members of the Mohawk Nation built some of North America's most iconic skyscrapers. Maybe you've seen the memorable photos from the early 20th century that feature long-haired brown men walking calmly across exposed beams at great heights. But the histories of the great migrations of Native Americans to cities more generally, and as a direct result of their lands being stolen, remain largely untold, contributing to what another Cherokee writer, Mary Jo Moore, terms a genocide of the mind, or erasure of contemporary Native peoples from discussions of modern urban life. Collapsed through metaphor, in King's version, the natural and cultural histories of indigenous peoples and birds provide the story's central spectacle. Yet the tragedy is also staged as diminished by the cleanup crew, who say there's not much anyone can do to help prevent the obvious suffering. Further echoing the prevailing settler attitudes today, the tourist returns to the doorman to proclaim that what he has seen is spectacular, meaning a spectacle to be admired. In the film version, the doorman, voiced by the author himself and presented to viewers as a coyote trickster who is just pretending to be a human, the doorman is the only one who laments the passing of the old days. He recalls wistfully, when they came through, they would black out the starry sky. As the film fades to a kaleidoscopic vision of swirling birds with the rising music that includes bird calls, Native American drumming, and chanting, the story's critical elisions of cultural and biological extinctions sit uneasily. The simultaneous eruption at the end of avian and human native song, for me, is what pinpoints a key shift from popular depiction of wild birds, particularly in their more ordinary cinematic habitat, of the nature film genre. The Academy Award-winning blockbuster of 2005, March of the Penguins, is more typical in its presentation of birdsong as diegetic noise, rather than purposefully featuring birds' own voices. Whereas in the script of the original version, La Marche de l'Empereur imagined a conversation between two penguins through two French human voice actors, the English language version features a stereotypical omniscient human narrator, a change seen by many critics as key to the film's ultimate international success. Marketed as educational, March of the Penguins presumably promoted environmental awareness by virtue of the threatened and endangered status of the avian star's entire species, even though the ambiguous storylines and presentations of its subjects make it difficult to say exactly what ecological benefits the film offers for the birds or for any other species, including our own. By fetishizing the fragility of endangered birds put in the crosshairs of climate change, such films might be said to add an environmental dimension to media theorist Akira Lippitt's thesis that images of animals migrate to the very modern representational forms, above all cinema, in which they are now perpetually caught in loops that mourn their passing. Viewed more precisely within the history of birds on film, the relations of social and aesthetic potentials appear far more vexed. As wildlife film historian Cynthia Criss explains, bird films in particular have served as forerunners of the nature films genre's troubling fascination with reproduction and sex alongside killing and death. What films like A Short History of Indians in Canada suggest is that there are ways of representing birds that also enable us to mourn the passing of a restrictive vision of life as entirely knowable through a human individual's perspective, and moreover allow us to use cinema as a means to visualize ways of being and dying that range beyond the ordinary pathways of anthropocentric thought. Of course, the ways in which birds on film have been made to illustrate human ideals presents a significant obstacle to these impulses. From the start of field photography, nesting birds were set in stories that tout the heteronormative imperative of reproductive coupling. The fact that early wildlife filmmakers, lumbered with heavy and otherwise stationary visual equipment, found an ideal subject in birds on the nest is oddly naturalized in too many popular film histories as the inevitable consequence of trying to represent charismatic fauna in a naturalistic style. Just a brief glance at the parallel careers of the pioneering UK wildlife author-filmmakers Oliver Pike and Cherry Kearton suggests how looking at wild birds complicates any sense of inevitability in the ethics of representation. Fascination with birds not only bookends the career of Pike, starting with his 1900 book In Birdland with Field Glass and Camera, and leading to such highlights as the 1934 film A Family of Great Tits. Birds are also writ large throughout the career of Kearton, co-author of the 1895 book British Bird Nests and director of the first acclaimed penguin-themed feature-length film Dassin, which was released in 1930. Their attunement to this particular class of animals, which suffered horrific decimations in that period, informs their shared sense of strong conservationist views, which were quite unusual for wildlife filmmakers of their generation. The evident damage of practices like egg collecting, bird hunting, fashioning hats with feathers, and again, erecting glass-windowed skyscrapers along migration routes appears to have motivated their central casting of species that were literally vanishing before these directors' eyes. Their books and films anchor critical perspectives on the simultaneous rise of birding as a hobby rooted firmly in 19th century obsessions with specimen collecting. Looking Backwards reveals a watch on the progress of extinction, brought on in large part by the activities of the human species doing the watching of the deaths of others. What is more disturbing about films like Pike's A Family of Great Tits is how along the way, live wild animals became cast in the nuclear family model of modern human life, and consequently less recognizably bird-like. Although initially conceived as part of a strategy to make birds' lives seem worth conserving, such films nonetheless set up the standard of a restrictively defined family of pair-bonded bio-parents plus kids that makes March of the Penguins appealing to conservationists and reactionary religious fundamentalists alike. I think it is instructive to note that even in their lifetimes, the pro-bird efforts of Pike and Kearton more directly became overshadowed by another example, The Private Life of the Gannets, which in 1934 became the first wildlife film to win an Academy Award, and includes many elements of the nature film formula that Walt Disney later made his brand of nature films. Directed by prominent evolutionary biologist and sometime eugenicist Julian Huxley, The Private Life of the Gannets introduces the familiar formula whereby wildlife film distinctly moves away from any meaningful engagement with deep ecological values and toward a narrow appeal to human self-interest. It is not that the film encourages anyone to hate birds. I actually like to show it to my students because they're shocked in good ways by the moment when the person roughly handling a gannet gets horribly bitten, but rather that it encourages us to value birds primarily as model parents. Wildlife film historian Derek Bouzet identifies how the casual use of analogies to human life enables moral projection and other kinds of misstatements, with the result that it sets a pattern whereby wildlife films intended as aids to understanding become impediments to it. Chief among these problems are the association of mated avian pairs with human ideals of sexual monogamy, which, of all the potential metaphorical couplings of birds and people, most egregiously defies scientific observation. While mating for life is common among certain species of geese, for instance, the vast majority of birds, and humans for that matter, engage in flirtations with serial monogamy, settling in with sex partners for a clutch at best before going their separate ways. Polyamory is the biological norm for them and for us, which makes bird films that disconnect the facts of life from reproductive fantasies of coupling all the more necessary, particularly in an era marked by disappearances rather than productions of life. What might birds have to say about this, if we could understand their language? The question is the conceit of my last example, again, a link to which is in the chat. The 2018 film, The Great Silence, is directed by Puerto Rican-based artists Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla, working in collaboration with US science fiction writer Ted Chiang, who authored a short story of the same title. Like Franz Kafka's many stories, including A Report to an Academy, the text of Chiang's story is styled as a soliloquy of a non-human narrator, here a parrot. But the film's setup makes this premise far more unsettling by deliberately disorienting the perspective. The film begins and is punctuated throughout with shots of the Arecibo Observatory, which, as the parrot explains, was a giant telescope built in Puerto Rico as part of the Search for Extraterrestrial Life program, both a transmitter and a receiver for messages to and from alien life. Noting that I and my fellow parrots are here, the bird asks, "Why are the humans not interested in listening to our voices? Aren't we exactly what humans are looking for?" The parrot goes on to explain that the titular Great Silence refers to the Fermi paradox, the problem that the universe ought to be teeming with the noise of life everywhere, not just on Earth. One solution to the paradox is that intelligent species hide for protection. Speaking as a member of a species that has been nearly driven to extinction by humans, the parrot explains, the parrot attests that this is a wise strategy. While the story's narrator plausibly could be a member of any parrot species, the film's visual presentation makes it hard not to hear more specifically a Puerto Rican parrot, also called the Puerto Rican Amazon, the Cortora puertorriqueña, or iguaca, which is a critically endangered species endemic only to that island. What seems particularly interesting is that the film presents the parrot's narration silently, using a kind of closed captioning or translation technology placement at the bottom of the screen, where line by line the story is superimposed over image sequences that only make sense as the parrot story progresses. The overall effect of the visuals works to create a sharp contrast between the futuristic shots of Arecibo and its techno-scientific apparatus, and that those sequences go back and forth with, they're intercut with primal rainforest shots, within which caged parrots slowly emerged in an endangered parrot sanctuary. The audio track reinforces the visual contrast with white noise-like sounds for the built environment and ambient bird song in the forest. The only connecting thread throughout, therefore, is the parrot's story, which I can only do a disservice here by summarizing. In short, the parrot reviews current biological understanding, including the 30-year study of the real-life parrot Alex by scientist Irene Pepperberg, to clarify not just growing recognition of non-human animal intelligence, but more precisely, the rare parallel between humans and parrots. Our two species are both highly communicative, vocal learners. The same impulses that drive humans as vocal learners to create facilities like Arecibo explain the importance of sound to human mythologies worldwide. We parrots can appreciate that, the narrator notes, but it also means that extinction for them entails more than just the disappearance of a group of birds. It represents a loss, the parrot explains, of our language, our rituals, our traditions. Another stroke of genius here is that the bird's character, in the sense of more than just personification, but more distinctively mental and moral qualities. Humans are not presented as the enemy in this story. The bird explains, "I can't blame them for not recognizing parrot intelligence until recently, for, he says, it's hard to make sense of behavior that is so different from your own. Rather generously, if also ironically, regarding the impending silencing of their voice as a species. While there's much more to say about who is the imagined addressee of the story, the final lines cleverly are presented as a message from their species to ours and echo the real-life parrot Alex's actual final words to Pepperberg. You be good. I love you. My gambit here is that the most interesting wild bird films today contribute significantly to broader formal shifts away from stories that anchor anthropomorphic or even zoomorphic ideologies of cinematic wildlife watching, which, again, Cynthia Chris documents as becoming predominant in the 20th century, and toward what performance theorist Una Chowdhury calls zooetic narrative forms that actualize a process in which questions are raised, possibly put to us, by non-human animals and with increasing urgency as these forms evolve into the 21st century. Non-humans may be specially enabled to enact this transition in filmic forms because, as animal historian Jonathan Burt clarifies, they confront us with moving visual surfaces that operate according to a different logic from psychological interiority, a quality that renders them richer for confronting the limits of forms of agency as well as normative ethical obligations. Pursuing Burt's point that in films, one is being asked to look without necessarily understanding what one sees. I encourage you please to watch, share, teach, and discuss the films A Short History of Indians in Canada, as well as The Great Silence. Again, the links are in the chat. And thank you again, everyone.
Большое спасибо, дорогая Сьюзен. Это было прекрасное выступление, очень интересный доклад, и мы благодарны вам за участие в нашей конференции. Я думаю, мы сейчас чуть-чуть подождем и зададим вопросы наших слушательниц, и также сами зададим вопросы, если останется время. Но вот предлагаю чуть-чуть подождать. Еще раз большое спасибо.
Да, вы можете задать вопрос на русском языке, и этот вопрос будет переведен на английский для Сьюзан. Или также написать в чате, можете на русском, на английском, либо мы переведем, либо переводчица.
Я бы могла пока, может быть, ответить на вопрос Сьюзен к аудитории, пока думают наши дорогие слушатели. Я вот думала про то, как птицы представлены в русской классической литературе, и у меня есть некоторые примеры, хотя я как бы совсем не литературовед и не обладаю тут какой-то качественной экспертизой, но вот я выделила каких-то авторов, которые могут быть любопытны, потому что на самом деле образы птиц действительно богато представлены в русскоязычной литературе, и очень часто они появляются в каких-то путевых заметках во время путешествий литераторов. Литераторы пытаются описать их внешний вид и повадки. Например, так делает Карамзин, это автор конца XVIII века. В дневниках Тургенева, это начало XIX века, также часто описываются птицы, особенно певчие, и это вообще особенность такая, может быть, не русской литературы, но очень много кто из авторов описывает птиц в связи с тем, как они проявляются аудиально, описывают их пение, есть даже попытки транспонировать вот это пение в язык и как-то передать его при помощи просто букв, слов. Птицы также появляются в, может быть, таком знаменитом романе Герцена «Кто виноват?». Это середина XIX века. Приблизительно в это время уже часто используются птицы как метафоры, но это вообще, мне кажется, супер популярный троп, а также, к сожалению, в контексте охоты, очень часто в каких-то охотничьих записках. Островский, например, использует образ птиц небесных, и это тоже такая особенность, может быть, русской литературы. Они всегда немножко проводники божественного из-за близости к небу. В Обломове Гончарова очень много птиц, и там даже важно, что они вслед за таким ленивым, отказывающимся от жизни хозяином перестают петь. Очень любопытно мне показалось, как птицы представлены у Мамина Сибиряка. Это такой потрясающий русский автор, который описал подробно быт на золотых приисках. Он тоже часто пишет о птицах, и часто это связано с... Он описывает периодически умирающих птиц, и, может быть, это как раз отражает какую-то экологическую обстановку. Ну и такие авторы, как Фет, Тютчев, Куприн, Бунин, тоже могут достаточно часто и трепетно описывать птичьи образы. Надеюсь, что это будет вам интересно. Может быть, у кого-то появились вопросы?
Да, есть два комментария.
Я могу зачитать комментарии? Лида пишет, у Пришвина часто используется, например, такое выражение «в краю непуганных птиц». Лида извиняется, у нее нет микрофона, поэтому она пишет в чате. Марина также пишет, что Виталий Бианки орнитолог и анималист в детской литературе, и можно обратиться к его трудам. Хорошо, тогда у меня пока вопрос к Сьюзан. Мне кажется очень важным то, как вы отмечаете вот этот вот переход от изображения птиц как, может быть, антропоморфных персонажей и желание дать птицам как бы существовать в кино на каких-то собственных правах и выражать себя. Это очень амбициозная и важная задача как в кинематографе, так и в литературе. И на мой взгляд, вот это изменение, оно как раз может развернуться во всей полноте, скорее больше в кино, потому что у кино есть потенция работать с внеязыковыми вещами, и это очень актуально в связи с проблемой изображения животных, в том числе птиц. Но и вот мне в этом контексте показался очень важным и, возможно, проблематичным второй пример, который вы прикрепляете, «Великое молчание», потому что там есть попытка, как бы, с одной стороны, говорить от лица птицы, с другой стороны, этот текст, это говорение, оно как бы не слышно, мы его только видим через вот эти вот субтитры. И как вы думаете, насколько вот такой способ действительно приближает нас к нечеловеческим животным, и почему как бы этот пример можно, может быть, рассматривать не так позитивно именно в связи с тем, что все равно через человеческую речь репрезентирован человеческий опыт. И что в этом все-таки может быть преодолевающего? Вот, извините за такую длинную формулировку.
No, this is very important to the problem that we're facing right now. And it's a problem that has persisted throughout my career. And that is that I'm, as you said, a literature specialist. And from the very start, I had pushback. People said, no, you're not writing about animals in literature. You're writing about what people think about animals in literature, that it's always somehow filtered, and that I'm not trying to pretend that's not true. But I still think it's important to look for the places where in writing we're doing more than just living inside our heads. It's getting out there, it's connecting, and we're able to shake up our egocentrism. We're able to look at more than just our own self-interests. We can think about how there are ways of writing that way. There are ways, certainly, where you're just encouraging people to march along and do the people thing, and to our own detriment and whatnot. But there are other ways of thinking and writing too. And I think that for me, this is what ends up drawing me back into it and making me keep looking and wanting to share and wanting to talk about films like The Great Silence, because when I teach it, I teach the short story first, so my students read that first and then show them the film in the classroom. And quite often they are aware in a way that they've never been before. And this is the way I felt when I first saw it, of how much I project my own voice when I'm reading a first person narration. But when it's broken as it is in these different layers and presented deliberately as distanced from one another, one thing I didn't mention that's really very moving and a really interesting choice on the part of the artists is that about halfway through the film, there's this close up of a single parrot who's doing that bird head tilt thing. And it's very hard not to look into that parrot's eye. And it's very hard to leave that film not thinking that parrots are intelligent. Quite often, my students who already thought that are, yes, this is a great film for that reason alone, because it is just so beautiful. And I can't say enough good things about it. It's not by accident either. Ted Chiang is one of the greatest living writers right now, for someone who does philosophy through creative writing. And that's really hard to do, but he's really good at it. So I think it's just a beautiful combination of very clever, visual, talented artists and a very talented writer collaborating through these very hard questions. Like you said, it's always a hard question of how do we represent the other in any sense, but I think particularly hard when the power imbalance is so exaggerated in the case of human species and all others in this particular historical moment that we're living in. Thank you. It's a great question. Not sure I answered it either.
Большое спасибо за ответ. Вы прекрасно ответили. Я, кстати, хотела сказать, что этот замечательный рассказ Теда Чанга был переведен на русский язык, и он опубликован в журнале «Иностранная литература». К сожалению, не помню, какой номер, но вот я его читала и тоже была очень удивлена. Нет, правда, чудесный фильм, я нисколько не пытаюсь его критиковать. У нас есть вопрос у Марины. Марина, вы можете его задать?
Да, я задам вопрос на русском языке, надеюсь на перевод. Большое спасибо за доклад. Вы начали его с метафоры The Birds and the Bees, которая сейчас мертвая метафора, ну, во многом. И кажется, что метафора, в принципе, такая форма уничтожения живого существа и превращения его в некий образ. И я здесь подумала вот о чем. В России, ну, в православном контексте недавно отмечался День Благовещения, с которым связана достаточно жестокая традиция, ну, которая, видимо, людьми не воспринимается и не осознается как жестокое выпускать в небо диких птиц. И люди идут на рынке и покупают птиц, которые были пойманы в лесу, это дикие птицы, привезены в город, их покупают, выпускают, и эти птицы обречены на смерть. И я хотела спросить у вас, знаете ли вы какие-то практики, ну, может быть, в Канаде или в США, ну, да, которые используют птиц, ну, вот до сих пор в качестве такого ритуала, символа, метафоры, ну, и как формы, по сути, уничтожения.
Oh my goodness. No, I wasn't aware of that tradition. And thank you for sharing that, because I think the more we talk about this, the more we can develop critical perspectives and question these practices. Wow. In North American settler practices, nothing is religious, everything's about capitalism. So the industry, I think the closest parallel is people buy pigeons for weddings. They call them doves. They're the domesticated pigeons that are bred to be white in color, and they call them doves and sell them. And similarly, they set them loose, and people are supposed to feel happy. But of course, these white, bright spectacle of a domesticated bird is easily picked up, easily hunted by others, and they're not, even if they were to escape predation, they're doomed because they can't take care of themselves. They're a domesticated animal. It's just an awful, awful thing. And yeah, similarly, just so sad for that. You're reminding me, in the journal that I edit, Society and Animals, not too long ago, we published a historical article about canary breeders, and this was very specific, I believe, to Northern Europe, and I'm forgetting exactly where, but there was a tradition of capturing wild birds because their songs were more beautiful. So ironically, those were the highly valued birds, and the ones bred in captivity who, yeah, at least would not have the same. Yeah, it's just very interesting to me that aesthetically people had this notion that they wanted wildness in their domestic world, and that birds had to suffer for that. It was just very strange. But I do think that some of this, as you said, with the Annunciation holiday tradition, that it is in a perverse way hearkening back to ways we know of living with animals in our daily lives, wild animals, living among them, that we all, I think, have a nostalgia for, that we all know we should be doing, and that this built modern world that we're all living in now is coming at a terrible cost, not just to us, but to them as well. And so I know that it's impossible to stop people from doing things like this, but to talk to them about what they want from it, and maybe, you know, to adjust it or do it differently in a way that doesn't have such a terrible pain and suffering and loss associated with it, might be one way of moving forward. I'm hopeful, but I don't know. Thank you though for mentioning that. It's very important. And thank you for teaching me too. I love doing these talks because I learn so much.
Thank you, Susan. We also have a question from Zlata Ulitina. Thank you, Susan. How do you think the medium of cinema in particular shapes our perceptions of avian life? How is it different from literature and visual art in regards to depiction of birds? Sorry for my English.
No, wonderful. Thank you. So birds, yeah, have this outsized presence in cinema history, and it's because they, when people first developed moving picture technology, the lighting was difficult to recreate interiors, and also too, I think people just had a fascination with capturing things on cameras. Same with the history of photography. So trying to go out into the field and get interesting footage to capture things, it was much easier to focus on birds, particularly in that time of the year, the time of their reproductive cycle, when they're returning to the nest. You could just have a stationary shot. The birds are coming in and out, but you can count on them continuing to come back. And because they have that outsized presence already in literary history, and I think, as we were talking about earlier, it has a lot to do with flying into the sky, I think, and this angel-like presence that they have. These associations with mythology and religion too, they come loaded with these human meanings. And so when they appear in cinema, it's really hard not to hard to see them just as birds ever. And that, I think, is why these two particular examples, I'm asking you to think with me through them, because these are filmmakers who are working intentionally, directly with literary writers. So they are trying to be creative. They're not hiding, they're not presenting real birds as if the bird could ever be representing itself, unless birds take over visual technology, in which case they might. But yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and one that I'm still struggling with too, because yeah, their meanings now for me, and I think for many others, are including this tremendous sense of loss that we're witnessing now worldwide and seem to be unable to stop. I'm not sure I'm answering the question again, but so please follow up.
Thank you, Susan. Мы также имеем комментарий от Алисы. Интересно и важно будет позже изучить то, как в литературе будет художественно или документально отрефлексировано то, что происходит сейчас с птицами в Анапе после разлива мазута. Ну, это просто комментарий. Так, у нас также есть осуждающие птичий рынок комментарии. И еще один комментарий от Златы. We have the similar thing with doves, especially for weddings and proms. Также Злата пишет, thank you for your answer. As birds are such dynamic species in their essence, it seems that moving pictures are especially fitting medium also. But yeah, they are too loaded with human-centric meanings. Так, и, видимо, у нас пока еще нет вопросов, но у нас еще есть время, и я хотела бы задать еще один вопрос. Я считаю, что очень важно, конечно же, говорить о кризисах, которые связаны с тем, что сейчас происходит с животными в мире. И очень здорово, что есть много фильмов и разных других произведений на эти темы, но мне кажется, очень часто, к сожалению, так бывает, что эти фильмы больше про кризис и про человечество, чем про птиц. И мне кажется, не менее продуктивным было бы в том числе думать про птиц вне кризиса, про птиц как птиц. Есть ли возможность как бы вот этой рефлексии и насколько она может быть продуктивной? Спасибо.
That's a really great question. And I think that's what I was aiming for, or at least part of what attracts me to this too, is that another way in which birds, as the first film, A Short History of Indians in Canada, reinforces, another way in which birds present a filmic spectacle throughout the history of cinema is in migration. So large groupings of birds moving large distances, that is something that we're witnessing, yes, in crisis moments, in wars with humans, but it's always happening with humans. And something that this global capitalist moment is illustrating is that it's not voluntary migrations. These are forced migrations, not just because of a geopolitical moment, but because of the ways in which climate crisis slowly does this violence, this cruelty that is maybe more frightening and maybe more dangerous because we don't think about it maybe in our everyday. We think, oh, you know, that happened over there and it's in the headlines and I need to pay attention to it. But it's happening all over everywhere right now, that people are feeling very insecure where they are. People are on the front lines of realizing that we as a species are running out of resources. We're blowing through all of the resources. And looking to bird counts and seeing those patterns over time, I think are one way in which we can start to wrap our minds around something that is too big maybe for us ever to completely understand or to even really recognize. That's where I'm going to in thinking about non-anthropocentric thought. It's not just thinking like other species, but thinking, you know, at different mega levels that are very disorienting, definitely. But if we're not working to try to take into account, we may be missing the big picture and we may be missing these other ways of thinking. But I don't think that's quite what you were asking, is it?
Ну, в какой-то степени об этом. Я имела в виду, вот есть категория фильмов, которые антропоморфизируют птиц. Это нам не подходит, это не самая лучшая репрезентация. Есть категория фильмов, которая говорит о птицах и экологических кризисах, проблемах, которые связаны с ними, и как будто бы это тоже не совсем про птиц. И я вот хочу помыслить о третьей категории, где вот этот образ птицы, ее репрезентация не будет обрастать вот этими дополнительными означающими, связанными с антропоморфизацией или с кризисом, хотя, безусловно, это все тоже очень важные этапы. Но вот какой-то освобождающий способ репрезентации птиц как птиц, который может быть, ну, как бы, в котором, может, не будет настолько прямого послания. Вот что я имела в виду. Спасибо.
Yeah, wow. I'm looking for that too. I would like to see this. And quite honestly, the person who is doing a really good job of looking for that right now is the film theorist Anat Pick. And her book on vegan cinema will be coming out soon. I met with her. We're friends, and I met with her in September, so she's almost finished. We've been, all of us who are friends of Anat really have wanted this book for a long time. And yeah, it does involve looking for examples from people who are being thoughtful in making films for animals, and not just using animals to make film, which is, I agree, the great, the vast majority of films. But it also involves bringing your mindset to it as well, to be able to appreciate that. And it's cultivating an audience for these kinds of films that, I guess, yeah, in order for them to be viable, that has to happen. But that's work that we need to do too. And that's through discussions like this and through our teaching, our research, that we all can be participating in that, even if we're not creative types and making them. But yeah, I think I would defer to Anat Pick right now, because I think she has much better answers to this very important set of questions. Absolutely, yeah. But from my perspective, it's also important to, my method is to look for patterns across time, or patterns in relation to a topic. So that's what I'm trying to present here, that these particular examples that I found are doing some interesting work in terms of making the connections to push back against disappearance more generally, and erasures, whether it's genocide, whether it's extinction. And I think that for me, that they're doing that now and that they didn't used to be doing that seems to me a really important problem to address too. What about our current time? What about the ways in which these filmmakers are working? And two, what is it about us as audience members prepared to appreciate that? I guess always a question with literature and film too is the stories that either didn't get written or they got written and they didn't get archived. So it may be the case that those films were there from the early days, but no one saved them. No one was ready to watch them. No one was ready to talk about them, and they were lost. That's entirely possible. So we may be surprised. Somebody might find an archive somewhere. Maybe there's a secret society of filmmakers who've always been doing this who will someday come out. We can hope anyway. But that's, I think, another important consideration too, is there is an old, from the mid 20th century theory of literature. It's Roland Barthes, the French structuralist, post-structuralist theorist, who famously said, literature is what gets taught. So there's no literature if it just sits on the shelf and no one touches it. It's got to be actively circulating somehow. And I think looking to Anat's example, her book, the Vegan Cinema book, when we're teaching that, I think that's where we're going to move into that territory that you're looking for, Antonina, which I'm looking for it too. So it's a great, great question. And I wouldn't do justice to the question if I could answer it. I think it's that important.